Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. I'm here to welcome you to the second event in the 2026 Liz and Bob Frenkel Environment Series. The title of tonight's presentation is Implications Found in Ancient Trees of the OSU McDonald-Dunn Forest with Dr. Meg Krawchuck and Charles Drake. There's one additional event upcoming in this series on May 13th. It's going to be virtual, just like this one. It's titled Lessons from the Land, Cultivating Abundance Through Land-Based Education. You can learn more about this event as well as register for it at the link that I am going to share in the chat now. There we go. So please read more about that event and register there. If you didn't hear, the first event in the Frenkel series was held on March 18th. It was titled A Kalapuya Legacy, Oaks, Savannas, and Prairies on OSU Lands with Dennis Albert. You can watch a recording of that event on the library's YouTube channel at another link that I'm going to share in the chat now. Give me a moment to do that here. And there's a link to that recording. As I said, this is the 2026 Frenkel series, so we've done previous years. There are previous videos in this series that you can watch. They are all on the library's YouTube channel, but I'm going to give you yet another link that is to all of the previous Frenkel series videos. I hope you'll check them out. There's so many interesting topics that have been explored in this series. So take a look. So as I'm sure you've noticed, we're using Zoom tonight. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we're going to try to answer some of those at the end. Usually to submit a question, you click or tap on the question mark, but it varies from device to device. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to hand it over now to Dave Eckert. He's the program chair for the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club. He's going to tell us more about the Frenkel series and introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And so let's see if I can get this working. I always have problems. There we go. Okay, can you see that, Bonnie?
Looks good. Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, welcome, like Bonnie said, to the Liz and Bob Frenkel 2026 series. If you didn't know Liz and Bob, you really missed a lifetime experience. There is and has been no other couple in the Willamette Valley that has had so much of an impact on the local, state, and national scene of environmental issues and policy. I'm not going to go into detail. Bob was a scientist, and Liz was the advocate. I never wanted to sit on the other side of the table from her. I always wanted to be on her side. She won more than you can imagine, and on all levels. So we're honoring them. They both passed away about 6 years ago. And this title, as Bonnie said, is Listening to the Land. And this is, we chose that title carefully because it is truly about listening rather than just telling. Output, it's input. And we're focusing on the ancient Douglas fir of the OSU McDonald-Dunn Forest. So this is very close to home, and most of you have been to the OSU McDonald-Dunn Forest. So I know you're going to enjoy this. I hope you appreciate the three co-sponsors of this, because we all have worked for a long time and put a lot of effort into doing this, and it's really a lot of fun. So this was founded by the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club, and just almost immediately in collaboration with the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, first with live presentations, and then once the pandemic arrived, we went full webinar and stayed there. And then the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition, particularly the Water Action Team, came on, and we've been sponsoring that, a major co-sponsor since then. Quickly, Bonnie had mentioned our series. Every year we have a theme, and in three lecture presentations. So if I really encourage you to go back and look at them if you've already seen them on YouTube, or if you've never seen them, I really recommend you see them. Then the beaver one, that made a big influence. A year later, state legislation was changed. So when we made this, there was a lot of talk about Oregon law, which was despicable. And there's a lot of pressure that came on and changed it for the better now. Reviving wetlands, 3 very important wetlands in the Benton County area that have been revived, and a conscious revival of wetlands. Transforming Mary's Peak, the series, we looked at the past, the present, and then the third one was about the future of Mary's Peak. And here's a picture from the same spot, one taken in 1910, which shows almost no trees up there, plus snow. And then the same time of the year, all of a sudden, all these trees. I should tell you a story right there. Last year, we did the String of Pearls series about magical river parks. We did them along the Marys River and the Willamette River, and I do recommend you look at those. And then last time, as Bonnie said, Dennis Albert just gave a wonderful talk about oaks, savannas, and prairies, again, on OSU lands and his discoveries there. And next month, there's Marta Capriles is going to do something quite different from the first 2. And her lessons from the land are really about how to cultivate abundance within our culture, but and then how to educate people with that as a land-based education. I promise you'll be impressed and you'll want to emulate what she's doing. So I hope you watch this. This will be a very special one also. And I'm really excited about tonight, the implications found in the ancient Douglas fir. Meg Krawchuck is a major player in the whole issue of analyzing trees and looking at fire issues. And I heard her name for a long time. I just met her tonight for the first time virtually. But all roads seem to lead to Meg and on these issues. And she is the go-to person, and we're deeply, deeply honored to work with her. And Charles Drake has been a student of hers, a master's student, and doing special work that he's going to be talking about tonight, which will deeply impress you. And I really look forward to this. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Meg. Take it away, Meg.
There. All right, here we go. Hi, hello, and thanks for joining us this evening. As Dave described, my name is Meg Krawchuck, and I'm an associate professor here in the College of Forestry at OSU. And I'm really excited about the work that Charles is going to share this evening. I want to share a few thoughts that I call connecting dots before we hand things over to Charles. So I'm going to load up these slides. We'll get to it. Let's see. Just a few slides. Go slideshow, go. Switch this over, and off we go. So, a few words as we get into things. I affectionately call this connecting some dots, a little bit of why it matters, some musings on why we're here listening to the land. So I put this slide sequence together to encourage us all to think about connecting dots from our own lives and our interests with the materials that Dennis presented at last meeting, that Charles will present today, in thinking about fire and our landscapes. So the first of these dots is right here. It's learning to coexist with fire in ways that are socially and ecologically just. This is my mantra, really. I hope it resonates with you a little bit. That's what this work is all about, in my mind. And that's what we as a society are needing to do as we increasingly appreciate the role and power of fire in our lives, its role in the histories of place and culture, and its role in the future. So, next of our connect the dots is the Olympic rings, the rings of fire, the chainmail, whatever comes to your mind. But this brings together some of our connect the dots and the why it matters to think about fire in Corvallis, the Willamette Valley, McDonald-Dunn Forest, Mary's Peak, landscapes of the Coast Range, up into the Western Cascades and beyond. Each of these rings is why it matters to be thinking about fire and our community. And Charles's work will touch on some of these things today. I want to start on the far left there with ecocultural restoration and think about what we're learning and what we all bring to these stories in thinking about Indigenous connection and stewardship of fire and ecology. That connects to the next dot, community wildfire protection, how we learn from that ecocultural knowledge to inform how we might learn to coexist with wildfire now and into the future. That connects to the next dot on the far right, climate change and adaptation. Knowing what we know about the links between climate change, between climate and weather and fire, there's an inevitable link between ecocultural restoration and fire communities, climate change. We go down to that lower circle on the left, ecosystem stewardship and management. What we learned from Dennis in the last meeting of the series, thinking about oak savannas, what we'll learn about from Charles in thinking about the more conifer-dominated parts of our landscapes and how these come together. Learning to coexist with fire needs to inform our ecosystem stewardship and management and how we perceive the stewardship and management of our old growth conifers and hardwoods. Now the one that's there in the middle, the curiosity, the natural history, the connection. I think we all have a lot of ideas of what that means to us. So I'll leave that to your own musings of that connect the dot in thinking about fire and coexisting. And then over there on the right, human health and well-being and recognizing that our livelihoods connect to all of these things and increasingly need to connect through coexisting with fire. The next of our dots, not really a dot really, but still important, this graphic from Bill Tripp, a Krawchuck tribal member from Northern California. This brings together wildfire, prescribed fire, and cultural fire, all part of this story. Wildfire is an unplanned or an uncontrolled fire. We're often most concerned about these for destructive outcomes, but there can also be beneficial wildfire. Prescribed fire, the next one in the middle there, is intentional fire with discrete and concrete resource objectives. We can think of that as beneficial fire. And then cultural fire, again, intentional fire that brings with it Indigenous knowledge, practices, and belief systems, and that good fire and beneficial fire element to it. So all of these are part of the fire story. Lastly, looping back in our fire story and our connect the dots to what Charles will be talking about today. This is a photo from one of Charles's field sites on the McDonald-Dunn. The title of Charles's talk, The Implications Found in Old Douglas Fir Trees on the McDonald-Dunn, connects all of these fire rings, as I hope you'll see as we connect some dots in the next hour or so. So, with those connected dots, some ideas to frame us. Over to you, Charles.
Okay. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Thank you, Meg. That was a wonderful introduction and some very important information on why all this matters. And yeah, thank you, Bonnie and David, for the introductions. Let's see here. Let me just get this set up here. All right, that's a start. All right. Yeah, and thanks to you all for being here. This is a great opportunity for me as well. I don't do these super often. I don't usually do request numbers like this unless I've been asked to do so. So thank you for being here and for giving me the excuse to kind of build on my career. So this will be sort of similar to the first presentation in this series. It was done by Dennis a few weeks ago. but it'll be more focused on tree rings, on this science of dendrochronology, and it's going to be much more focused on our Douglas fir as a species. But it'll still be concerned with the same environments, the same geography, and the same history. I should let you guys know, in the course of this presentation, I'll be referencing sort of specific locations throughout the college forest, throughout the McDonald, with maps or with other descriptions. So if you're not super familiar with the landscape, I apologize, but I do think that some of the principles that we'll discuss here are fairly universal, and it'll be an opportunity, if nothing else, to start building that familiarity. If you're not familiar with it already. Okay, here we go. Well, I'm wondering if any of you have seen this tree before. If you've hiked the old growth trail on the McDonald Forest, you'll park at the Lewisburg Saddle and you'll walk out that road and you'll walk that trail and you'll pass a little bridge. And if you look over your right shoulder, you'll see this tree. If you've hiked to any extent on the college forest, you probably walked right underneath it. And yeah, kind of a strange way to open us up here with kind of a totally unfair rhetorical question based off of one tree out there. But I do think that there are some characteristics, some aspects of this tree that are useful for talking about a sort of history of fire and more sort of savanna conditions. And so I think this will hopefully be in keeping with the theme of listening to the land. One of the things that I hope folks get out of this presentation is more of more sort of skills to get out there and be able to recognize some of these biological legacies, both live and dead, for what they are, and be able to go out to your favorite hiking place, whether that's in this county or in another country, and to be able to go out to maybe your own property and kind of use these tools to ask what the land used to look like, where you call home, and kind of what the history of fire might be. Let's see. So this will be more of a tree ring perspective, and it'll be mostly focused on the deadwood component. So this is a live tree we're looking at now, but for the most part, most of the data that I have to sort of speak through is from old stumps. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I think that there is certainly a sort of power and accuracy in this discipline that allows you to ask some very interesting questions. But what I'm also going to suggest, and it sort of pains me to say it, is that you don't need this. You don't need dendrochronology. You don't necessarily need rigorous methods and finely tuned instruments to measure tree rings and things like that. If your basic question is just, what did this landscape used to look like, and if you're just trying to gauge the extent to which fire and people played a role. Okay. Let's see. So let's look into the details of this tree a little bit more. I don't know if you can see that on the left of your screen, but if you look kind of at the top of that left image, you'll see a little conch, a little sort of woody mushroom, and that's the fruiting body of something called a quinine conch. I don't know the Latin name for that, but based off of the sort of timber cruising notes that I've looked at, it's a pretty good indicator and highly associated with trees that one are very old, centuries old, and two, trees that have experienced fire damage. So you can see at the base of this tree, it's very swollen. And so what the tree is doing is literally trying to bolster itself as it kind of rots from the inside. And so it's not a particularly obvious sign of fire, but it's there. To the right of your image, you'll see those low-hanging branch stubs. So that's a legacy of these trees growing up in more open conditions when periodic fires were kind of thinning these stands out and sort of creating a more low density forest stand of trees. And then of course over time, a lot of those branches, Douglas fir being sort of shade intolerant, sort of thinning of those branches. These are still more pictures of the same tree. Hopefully the one on the left gives you some idea of the sort of the context, the surrounding of this tree. It really doesn't have any other sort of close neighbors that are in its same size and age category. Lots of younger trees, mixed species, fairly heavy brush. So in addition to kind of signs of fire, it also, in its modern sort of context, also reveals kind of a sign equally of a lack of fire in more recent times. And the image to the right is just so you can get an idea of the age of the tree, this sort of asymmetrical, wolfy roughness to the crown that kind of belies that centuries old characteristic. And still more pictures of the same tree. I didn't actually take the one on the left. That was from Bob Zyback's master's thesis in 2000. But this is the same tree about 35 years apart. One of my sort of favorite things about working in this space, working on the college forest, is that it's such a kind of rich tapestry of human history, not just this sort of deep time tree ring record where we're sort of diving into more of the indigenous history, but even some of the more recent kind of local history. And as I explore this area and I do research in this area, I'm constantly, just feeling like I'm kind of walking in other footsteps, and I'm constantly running over old survey monumentation, old research flagging and signage, and just everything. But it just makes for a very sort of rich and enjoyable place to work. Let's see. Yeah, at one time when the photo on the left of the screen was taken, this was regarded as the largest Douglas fir on the college forest. I don't think that was true then. I don't think it's true now, but still very much a dandy tree. And if you get a chance to look at it, hike the old growth trail, and you can see it from the trail. You can see it very well just from the trail. So give it a look if you're in the neighborhood. It's just an example of a different old growth tree. This one's on the Dunn Forest, kind of close to the 440 road. This is just kind of an example of kind of a similar class of tree, but with some more obvious signs of fire. You can see that sort of hollowed out cavity that you can almost sort of crawl into, and inside you can sort of feel around, and it's all charred out. So I don't have too much to say by way of kind of historical and sort of cultural history leading up for what I'm mostly going to cover, but it's still a very important topic. So it's really important to understand that when we're working in this space, we understand that we're working in a cultural fire regime. So what that means is that fire is primarily coming from people, and that fire is sort of intricately interwoven into their cultures, and that this has been going on for thousands of years. So that's kind of what that means for our space. And this quote by Robert Boyd that I really like, I think just kind of summarizes that to a T. And there's a very impressive body of evidence that supports this, that includes historical accounts and ethnographies. It even shows up in works of art that you can see here to the right. So this is a lithograph by Henry Ware done in 1845 that depicts the Willamette Valley and the sort of gallery forests that you can see lining those ridges. You can see prairies and savannas, and people themselves seated there. And there's other sort of drawings and sketches of the landscape. So it's very well supported. This idea of sort of intense human involvement with the land. It also shows up in short-term fire histories, which I'll be sort of covering. It crops up in longer-term fire histories that are based off of soil charcoal and sort of sediment in lakes and things like that. And of course, it's very much alive and well in the living culture of the descendants of the Kalapuya and other indigenous peoples. It's still very much alive today. So that's all that I'm going to say as far as kind of, at least for now, as far as kind of that historical setup. But seeing as this is a library talk, I do have a few book recommendations that can cover this topic with much more sort of authority and accuracy and just much more research than I can. The one on the left, Indians Fire and Pacific Northwest by Robert Boyd, has some just excellent descriptions of what these fires looked like, their frequency, their intensity, seasonality, and also what fire meant for people during different times of the year, and a bit about fire as a means of food and fiber production, and not just in the Willamette Valley, but also in other environments across the West. And it was a really good resource for me, and is one of the most, I think, heavily cited and sort of well-respected sort of introductions to the topic. And the book to the right, so this is Tribal Histories of the Willamette Valley by David Lewis. This book much more closely follows the story of the people themselves, and there's also some really great information on fire in there as well, but it really hones in on this period of conflict between indigenous people and settlers in kind of that 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s sort of time period. And very much describes the movement of some of the leaders of these communities and how they survived different stages and facets of colonization. So both very, very good, very fascinating books, both available. You can check them out at the Corvallis Library, and I believe one or both of them is available for purchase at one or both of the Benton County Historical Society locations, both the Corvallis and the Philomath. But I'm less sure about that. And also for more cultural perspectives, definitely check out the Champonefu webinar series, another series that was supported by this same library, very excellent for some of that more cultural perspective. Okay, so now we can almost start the tree ring part of this this presentation. But before we sort of get into that, we need to sort of discuss like the basics of how trees grow and how and what a fire scar is and how we recognize them and date them and how we find them on the landscape. So this will be sort of how trees grow 101. So trees grow not from the inside out or the outside in, but rather from the outside outward. So you can almost kind of think of it like an old house that keeps accumulating layers of paint, and each year you get another sort of slick of paint on there. And with each subsequent layer being formed on the one beneath it. So this is kind of a simplified diagram of a stretch of tree growth. So the tree is going to start sort of to the right of this picture at the pith. So that's that kind of first growth of that first sort of annual growth ring, and then it's going to kind of radiate from there. So you can see the direction of growth on that diagram as well. And so each year, a tree puts down a full annual ring, which is itself made up of the early wood, which is your lighter color, less dense kind of spring wood that starts to be put on right around this time of year. And then you also have the late wood, which is part of the same year's growth, but it's put on more in the sort of early summer and early fall months, so kind of later season growth. But they each together make a full annual ring. Okay, so let's dive into just one single ring. Now this image is hopefully you can see well enough to actually see individual cells in this ring. Note the direction of growth here in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. So this whole cycle of seasonal growth starts, like I was saying, right around this time of year, late March, early April for most of the Douglas fir in this area. And so you're gonna start putting on that early wood throughout April and June. So we're kind of going up this screen here, and then right around July is when you're going to start transitioning into that more dense, darker late wood, and that's going to extend usually through August, September, usually most of October, and in rare cases even into, if it's a particularly mild year, it can go even later than that. And then you'll have another dormant season, and it'll start over again. So that's kind of the growth kind of year round. So the whole kind of science of dating tree rings and dating old wood samples and sort of connecting all these dots relies primarily on two principles. One is that trees put on one ring of growth for every year. And so for that reason, we can sort of rely on basic arithmetic as we're sort of counting back in time And then the other principle that we rely on is that trees respond to a climate signal, and that trees in a shared climate will respond in the same way. So what we do is to build a sort of record of tree growth, to build out these patterns, what we'll do is we'll start by taking small samples from live trees and kind of building them back in time. So let's see. Yeah, we'll start by taking samples from live trees and kind of matching that climate signal with some older wood samples, kind of like a barcode. So you can kind of see in this image to the left, you have sort of one line that's kind of on the upper right that has kind of the most recent rings, and then as long as you have sort of enough of a record, you can build back and kind of overlap those patterns and pick up the pattern again, and then rely again on your arithmetic, counting back and sort of assigning annual growth to those sort of years one after the other, and just keep building back like this. And so this is kind of how ultimately this science has archaeological implications, is because as long as you can keep building a record, you can go back as far as there is some wood sample that exists on the surface or in the ground or buried, in a river somewhere or something like that. Let's see. And so this is what that first part of that process looks like. So this is coring a tree. This is where we're sort of augering in with a little sort of small diameter drill bit and pulling out a real thin strip of wood. And so that's kind of how we start to build a record from live trees, and that's kind of the start of it all. And we can do this without really doing any harm to the tree, which is great. Let's see. Yeah, I think I already covered that. Okay, so what makes a fire scar? So what makes a fire scar, and how do we date a fire scar to a particular calendar year? So in general, there are, if you can date the tree ring, you can date whatever scar happens to appear in that tree ring. So to identify what is properly a fire scar, you usually need three basic indicators. One will be the sort of localized dead cambium, where the external heat source has killed that cambium at that spot. You'll also get sometimes some localized resin sort of compartmentalized behind that wound. The tree does that primarily to protect itself against subsequent insect attack and things like fungal decay and that type of thing. And then what the tree will also start doing is, where it hasn't sort of been locally killed, it'll start to grow around that wound, and so you'll get these nice sort of curling features, and that sort of wood grain pattern is very noticeable even on samples that aren't even processed or anything like that. Yeah, I don't know if I want to mention it. I think I will mention it now. Yeah, so I've all throughout the presentation, I'll use words like fire scars and wounding and tree injuries and things like that, which are typically words that have sort of negative connotations. But I hope people are encouraged to think of it more like, when trees experience fires, it really sort of just changes them. And I'll try to give some examples of that later on, but it certainly changes how they grow, how they allocate resources, and their strategy. I mean, trees are responsive, and they understand kind of what's going on around them. So so don't necessarily think of fire scars as like a totally negative thing that's bad for the tree, or something like that. Okay, I think that basically covers it. So this is kind of a sort of typical fire scar, typical in sort of its condition, but also typical for this data set in particular. And I'll get into that in a moment, but it's got everything you need. It has this sort of localized cambium death. It has that resin that's sort of packed behind it, that's sort of marking where exactly that tree sort of partially died. And then, of course, it has the subsequent rings that are starting to heal over, it's starting to curl over and kind of protect that wound. The other thing to mention here, because we did talk about seasonality and kind of where in the season the tree is putting on certain types of growth. So this is how you can determine not just the year that a fire occurred, but also the season. So in this case, what we have is the injury, which the line of which is kind of marked by that sort of crystallized pitch that you can see there, is really splitting that late wood in two. So if we go back, oh boy, if we can go all the way back, just to reference when our late wood is being laid down. So August to October. So this is a fire that's probably burning sometime in August or September, and that's very typical for and very usual for fire scars in this data set that we found from the McDonald-Dunn, is this burning into the sort of late summer months. So burning during some of the hottest and driest times of the year. Okay, wow. So this is actually the start of my favorite part of the program. This is sort of the start of the gratuitous parade of wood samples and fire scar methodology section, which I really like because it's just a bunch of really pretty pictures. So what are we really looking for when we're going out to find these fire scars? Well, we're looking for material that's old and dead. Something like this, an old stump that's been cut decades ago. And we want it to be old. Like we want that stump to have a lot of rings in it because we're trying to build a record as far back in time as possible. We want the thing that we're sampling to be not too rotten because we do, it does have to sort of survive the trip. And ideally we want something that has some sort of external sign of fire. So in this case, you have what we sometimes call a cat face, which is a sort of charred concavity that's formed as subsequent fires continue to scar the tree at one point, and it kind of forms this buttressed sort of asymmetric kind of hole on the side of the tree. So that's really what you're looking for when you're out there looking for kind of that more obvious fire evidence. Let's see. So this work typically involves the chainsaw, and this kind of gives you an idea of how we have to sort of break the stump apart to get the sample that we're looking for. Typically this is what it looks like. In rare occasions, you might have to, if you have a very fragile sample, you can do something like this, where you might have to sort of reconstruct and sort of bolster the piece and kind of reinforce it. It really does not happen very often, but sometimes you have to turn to more delicate tools if what you're trying to pull out of the forest just happens to be very fragile. And so hopefully you'll start with something like this in the field and bring back something that looks more like this. Typically, this is what you'll take out of the field. This is a sort of partial cross section, so we don't really take that much wood, although it's heavy enough. And you'll be able to see, hopefully you can see on this piece, that sort of dark charring in the center of that piece of wood that's wrapped in blue plastic. So that's more of that fire evidence, more of those sort of stacked fire scars. And we'll see more pictures of that here in a little bit. So you'll take that in, bring it to the shop. So it's in the shop, and we're going to sand it up until it looks like this. And sometimes we'll put nice labels on it. Sometimes we won't, but we'll catalog all of those fire dates, and we'll catalog the pith when this tree was first established, its establishment date. And so this is the information that we get out of those, mostly rotten wood samples. We get a lot of information. Just for so hopefully, there's some continuity that you guys can see, in the before pictures and after. So just to have more fun. We have even more of it. Yeah, so this is actually the same stump. This is the same piece of wood. And so on the left image, you can see, and I have little date call outs for those fire dates, but you can see how, hopefully you can see those same fires on that same sort of geography of the wood grain and that surface. So there are some times when you'll be out there in the forest and you'll essentially be able to see the piece as it is. That doesn't always or usually happen, but on some rare lucky occasions, you can just look at it and say, yep, that's what I'm looking at is at least 4 or 5 or 6 fire events. So what do these fire scars typically actually look like? Well, this is one that I feel represents the data set as probably better than just about any. I want to note that the white labels in this case actually don't correspond to fire scars. They correspond to those marker years. That I don't know if I mentioned marker years. I don't think I did. Well, in my discussion of building the those tree ring chronologies, we rely very heavily on these marker years, which are kind of years of that are abnormally, these rings that are abnormally skinny or fat, that sort of correspond to different to more or less kind of favorable climate conditions. And so you can use these marker years sort of statistically, and you can measure a piece and run it by software, or you can just sort of do it visually. So this is and so these just happen to be 4 marker years that were very convenient for my data set: 1843, 47, 49, and especially 1858, which are all sort of relatively skinny years. And what I would very often find is a run of fire scars leading up to that point, and then really no fire afterwards. So sometimes when a piece would come into the lab, it'd be as simple as just finding that last fire date, finding those 4 marker years, and boom, I got it. Like that piece is essentially kind of solved. It's become known. So yeah. And yeah, just so you get an idea of some of the intervals that these are the fire dates that were recorded on this piece. So we're looking at fire pretty consistently every 3 to 7 years up until about the 1840s, around the year 1850, and we'll see this in other ways. We'll see this pattern in other ways later in the program. And this is just kind of zooming into those marker years. Hopefully you can see that the ones that I've pointed with those white labels are kind of at least skinnier than their neighbor. Hopefully that's at least somewhat clear. But again, that same pattern of just stacked fire scars throughout the 17 and 1800s, followed by really very little fire after the 1840s. So this is a pattern, and I show all these pictures just to kind of I mean, this is one way of looking at the data. Just you can get a sense of what's going on here without any sort of heavy statistics or even mapping or even any other sort of visualization. If you just sort of look at enough of these things, you can see what's going on in this space. Here's the same pattern yet again. I think this is maybe also the same piece of wood as my intro slide. But yeah, lots of fire and kind of some differing and variable intervals. You'll see some fires that are only a few, 2 or 3 years apart, and others that are, maybe a decade or more so apart. Again, just another good example of some of those intervals that we see, 3, 4, 5, 6-year intervals. And every so often, you'll get a fire. You'll get a fire that's recorded on the same piece in subsequent years. So these are, the left and the right are 2 different stumps, and they each record a fire in subsequent years. So this is basically, proof that annual burning did occur, and it also, was enough to scar these trees in both years. And so that annual burning is represented here, just as it is in the ethnographies and in the oral traditions. So, and we don't see this a whole lot. And I sort of suspect that it happens more so than it's actually recorded. And what I mean by that is that because the more sort of frequent fire you get, the more fuels you've consumed, and probably the less likely you are for that same tree to scar again. So this is maybe more of a rare occurrence to see in the tree rings themselves, but I think perhaps not. So I suspect not quite so rare in real life. Yeah, so this is just another good stack of fire scars. I bring this one up just to show, again, not only that variability in those intervals, but also just kind of the different looks that some of these scars can give you. Sometimes they'll be characterized by, they'll be larger or smaller. Sometimes they will have more or less kind of resin staining. Sometimes they'll lack any sort of staining altogether. Yeah, fire scars have a tendency to show up in a stacked formation like this, and you've seen this plenty in the other images. But with each fire sort of setting up the next fire to scar at that same location, as the tree is somewhat more sort of thin barked on that side, or or something that's kind of helping the energetics of fire to kind of scar that tree more readily at that location. So this is actually my favorite part of the presentation, which is very small trees enduring one or multiple fire events. So this is actually the first stump that I ever cut into in the project that I was a part of. So this is a tree that survived its first fire when he was about 5 years old, and survived 2 other fires in the 1600s. And so that's a white oak acorn there for scale. So it gives you an idea of what these sort of essentially seedlings are able to survive in at least some cases. And we don't see it too often, but we see it enough such that it's not a particularly rare thing. Yeah, here's an even older fire. I think actually this on this sample, this was the only scar that this tree recorded, was one when it was very, very small, very young. And in some cases, these scars are too small to even be compared with an acorn. So this is a tree that was just a few millimeters across when it was scarred first, and it's growing at a fraction of a millimeter every year. So I don't show all these images to argue that all trees scar when they're young, or that all trees sort of grew slowly in this historical period. By no means, but I do sort of throw it up there because I think it's sort of I sort of admire the pluck of these little trees, and I think it's somewhat a testament to their resilience, these trees to survive. But I think even more importantly, it speaks to the environment in which these fires are happening, the fuels that are being burned, and the skill with which fire is being applied on this landscape. So fire is being applied repeatedly in a way that is allowing species and these trees to survive recurring fires, trees that aren't generally regarded as being sort of highly resistant to fires. Okay, I think this is the last tree ring picture. So this is actually a tree core that was taken from the oldest tree that we identified. This one was taken from the Dunn forest, actually, and this is kind of the innermost part of that tree ring. So we're looking at the kind of the innermost part of the tree here. So this tree dates back to the late 1400s. I don't actually have a sort of pith date. I don't know exactly when it was established, but again, you see the ability to survive that sort of fire when they're quite young. Well, actually, in this case, this tree was close to 50 years old when it recorded this fire, but it was only about the size of your forearm, and it was only a few inches across. So just some nice images that kind of describe, I think, just what these trees have sort of lived through, and it's just kind of an amazing thing. So I'm going to take us on a very short sort of virtual tour here in a bit, but before we do that, just for those that are unfamiliar with kind of the area that we've been talking about, so here's the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and then sort of subset in there, you've got our study area. This is the McDonald-Dunn forest. Here it is sort of in its outline. I think we saw a similar map from Denny's presentation last time. So you've got the Dunn Forest to the north and the McDonald Forest to the south, both of which are just north of the Corvallis city limits. And sort of dividing these two forests is the Soap Creek Valley, which is sort of valley bottom setting, where you have the OSU beef ranch and some other ag lands that we saw pictures of in Dennis's presentation. Okay, so let's take a little hike together. I want to start us off in probably one of the most popular spots on the College Forest. So this is the Lewisburg Saddle parking area. Hopefully, the little inset road map will be helpful. We're actually going to flip it around. Right now, we're looking sort of vaguely northeast, but we're going to flip it around actually and go the other way. We're going to cross the county road here, and we're going to pop down just past this gate to this next intersection, only about a few hundred feet, really. So now we're at the intersection of the 600 and the 610 road. And just off to the left here, you can see an old stump, something that, most days, most people, myself included, are just likely to walk past without giving a second thought. But let's take a closer look at it. So from this angle, can't really tell a whole lot, but it's relatively large and quite eroded. But let's take a look at the other side. So now we're looking back at the parking area. Let's zoom in just a little bit here. Okay, now we're starting to see some features that hopefully you're a little bit familiar with now at this point in the presentation, and it's these features. So this is our sort of external fire indicator that's really very useful. And so we'll focus in on one of these, on this one in particular, because it's just a little bit more dramatic. And so this is really what we're looking at. So this is evidence of sort of multiple fires. This is that kind of cat face feature I was talking about. So each one of these sort of concentric layers, these curls that you see here, represents a unique fire event, and I've kind of marked them with the yellow numbering. So that's kind of where I think those fire scars are. But hopefully you can sort of see them associated with each one its own sort of crack. And so, so in this case, this is at least 6 unique fire events and probably more buried behind it. So this is just an example of how you can drive 5 minutes and get out of your car and walk 2 minutes and just be able to see hundreds of years of history and Indigenous fire stewardship, it's very it's not sort of hugely sort of noticeable, but if you take the time to look and appreciate it, it's definitely there. You don't see too many of this. This one in particular is probably one of the more sort of noticeable and accessible, but if you see something like this, by all means, look and admire, but treat it with respect, and obviously, stay on the trails and the road system. Very sort of rich history there, and of course, at some point, everything is going to rot away, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important to to take some of these wood samples and to sort of learn from them and prepare them and preserve them. But I also think it's great to leave some of them out there so people can come and appreciate them in this form. So that's one that you can see. If you're perhaps a more intrepid biker doing loops up in the Dunn Forest, you'll be able to find a really great stump out there that you can stop and admire. So at the intersection of these 300 and 400 roads, there's a kind of 3-way intersection. There'll be a very small island in the middle of it. And if you look past this young stump of it's maybe only 100 years or so, or maybe even less, you'll see an old stump that was cut probably before that young stump that's more in the foreground had even germinated yet. And so we'll zoom in on that next. So this is kind of that same image, except you're looking at it sort of more top down. You're looking at the end grain, and you can hopefully see my same sort of numbering there. So you're looking at sort of multiple recurring fire events, and the advantage here is that you can even kind of see roughly like how many years are between each fire event. So that's kind of the advantage of looking at it by the end grain. But so you can look at a fire history record just as we've done. You can look at it. I mean, you can appreciate fire history just from looking at the raw samples, the stumps out in the woods. You can look at it from a sort of more polished standpoint after they're all prepared. You can also look at it. You can also visualize it differently with graphs and maps. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit here. So this map, so you can see the same outline of the McDonald-Dunn forest, and then those other different colored polygons. So those are sort of sites within which I've collected fire scarred cross sections, the samples, and so those are marked with those sort of dark gray circles. And so you can see that there's 5 sites, and there are different sizes, and there are different numbers of samples, different numbers of observations, just different amounts of data in each kind of site. And so when you summarize fire history in this way, and in the way that I'm going to do here in a little bit, you're kind of summarizing it based off of not sort of one point in space, but based off of kind of a general area, which is sort of an important note. Okay, so these are all timelines that represent the number or rather the occurrence of a fire event at some point in each one of those sites. So each horizontal line is kind of a timeline of each of those sites, and they're made up of multiple stumps, and each one of those vertical tick marks represents a unique fire event at that site. And so probably the most striking thing that you're going to notice from this data set is the very pronounced sort of downturn of fire occurring after about the year like 1850 or shortly before 1850. That's probably the most sort of pronounced and obvious sort of signal that we have here. And you'll notice the sort of the timeline at the bottom. So this is just 1700 to 1925, which is kind of the main analysis period that I dealt with. But that pattern of lack of fire certainly extends throughout the 20th century and still persists. And prior to the year 1700, I just don't have quite as much. That's kind of when the record starts to peter out. I don't really want to spend too much more time on this figure, other than to just say that so in kind of the table to the right where you have n equals, so that's just the sample size. So that's basically just saying like how many stumps did I collect at each one of those sites. So if you're looking at this graph and you're saying like, oh well, McDonald North has much more fire than the PV site, well, at least part of that is due to just sampling effort, just the amount of, and that was all just kind of a function of where I could find material and the time that I had to complete it. So what you're looking at is, at least in part, the sort of differences across the sites. What you're looking at is, at least in part, just that kind of different sampling effort. You also might notice that the minimum fire return interval for all of these sites is 1. So basically what that means is there was a 1-year fire return interval observed at some point in each one of these sites across their time period. So basically there's evidence of annual fire at relatively fine spatial scales across the whole forest, is basically what that means. You can also just kind of plot your sort of where you detect fire locations on a map and just kind of explore it that way. So, and that's kind of what I did. So in this case, again, you have your dark gray dots. Those are where you've taken samples, and in these maps that I'll show you, where you see them lit up with orange. So that's just showing where in this year I detected a fire event. So this is the year 1752 that I just show for example. And so this is just an example of a year in which I found fire at only one location. It's something that I call an isolated patch burn. That's not super important, but what is important is that there are a lot of fires that I detected across the couple hundred years of good sample depth, or just fires recorded at one location. So that was, small fires are clearly a very important part of this landscape. And so just building, more into more larger and sort of complex fire shapes. So this is just an example of kind of the same features as the last sort of map, but a case in which I found an isolated patch burn at sort of multiple locations. So I call this multiple patch burns. You can kind of think of these different colored dots as kind of yeses and nos across the landscape, with the yeses being these orange dots, these, yes, I burned at this location, and the nos being kind of, these gray dots, like we have, we have sort of sample depth here, but we didn't detect a fire at this date. It's important to note that not every tree is going to record every fire. So the no's aren't as reliable as the yeses, is what that means. A tree can experience a fire while not also recording it as a scar. But if you do get enough of these no's sort of clustered together, then it starts to become a bit more reliable. So again, getting into some more complex shapes where it becomes harder to interpret, at what point do I have a kind of contiguous sort of boundary around here? And that's, kind of up to your interpretation and your expert opinion. But for my purposes, it was just kind of a matter of, sort of creating these different categories for descriptive purposes. There are some fires, however, and we don't see quite as many of these that really do appear to be fairly large and extensive. They don't happen quite as often, but they're there. 1776 is a great example, and probably one of the best examples of fire detections that really seem to suggest a more large and contiguous surface, which, if it was the case, would mean that this would have been a fire in, kind of the 1,000+ hectares, potentially, a couple thousand acres. So that kind of just gives you an idea of the range of, fire size and complexity that we see in this data set. And this graph I just sort of include just so you can get an idea of kind of the breakdown of, do we see small fires in the historical record more than large fires? And what we see is, by and large, the vast majority of fires that we see are in this this type 1, type 2, which is, those kind of isolated burns, or maybe they're burning in like multiple isolated areas in the same year. And with the larger events being a more sort of decadal, sort of occurring at a more decadal frequency. Small fires are very important to this fire regime. So I didn't go through each of these details that explain each of these key takeaways, but if I didn't explain it, if I didn't sort of dive into it, these are really, and so this is kind of one of my text, more sort of text heavy slides. But these are really the important things if your questions, and if you're just curious about the fire regime for the McDonald-Dunn prior to settlement. This is really how I would describe it. Fire on that spatial scale is very much annual, but it doesn't mean that the whole area is burning. It just means that somewhere, someplace, there's a fire happening every year. Fire size is certainly highly variable. Fire is very much a feature of the late summer months usually, but we also detect it in some of those in the spring and fall, and kind of more of those shoulder seasons, just not quite as much. And probably the biggest thing to take away, which is that after about the year, it's sort of the late 1840s, fire becomes just much more rare and almost absent from the record. And this is the result of different sort of facets and aspects of colonization, disease, and kind of intrusions by farmers, and some of those negative interactions, and then of course ultimately the sort of establishment of the reserve system, the system of Indian reservations. So this is, and so that's really why you see that dip in that record of fire, and that aligns pretty well with other sort of historical sources. So yeah, nearing the end here. This is a slide that I was kind of hoping to sort of end on kind of on a good note, end on a high note. This is actually one of my favorite pictures of kind of how I like to imagine what parts of the McDonald-Dunn used to look like. So this is actually taken from an Oregon white oak restoration management guide. My apologies for the quality of the image, but hopefully you can see some of the important features there that between myself and Dennis we've talked about. You know, these isolated oaks, these oak patches. You can even see sort of copses and groups of isolated Douglas fir trees, and sort of maybe a more sort of heavy sort of forested component on the ridge lines, and so it kind of has a little bit of everything there. And I think this image more than anything else kind of makes me excited for just what restoration is going to look like. And yeah, I'm just kind of excited for kind of the return of these kind of visuals, and just excited to see what we make of this shared space that is our home. You know, the Willamette Valley, McDonald-Dunn Forest. The data set that I have that I can speak to, it doesn't prescribe by any means that every part of the college forest needs to look like this, or that we need to be burning at fine scales every year. But what it does say is that fire is an important part of this ecosystem, and that somewhere you need some of this and you need more of this. So that's kind of that's what I think my sort of some of this research kind of speaks to. And one just last thing that and this will be my last slide, but one thing that I like to kind of reflect on, and I've heard it mentioned by many people, mostly folks my age and younger, but also as people of all ages. There's just a lot of stress and anxiety associated with climate change, and sort of how it's going to affect our trees, and especially our old trees and old forests. So here in this image, this is taken from one of the oldest trees, the oldest stumps that I cut into. And these white arrows are actually calling out not fires or sort of marker years as they have elsewhere in my presentation. These are actually pointing to very pronounced reductions in growth. So you'll get these kind of compressed periods of time where the tree is, for one reason or another, whether it's climate or fire or disease or wind breakage or what have you, but for whatever reason, the tree is sort of expressing, much less growth. It's enduring some sort of stress. And I don't wish to in any way kind of belittle, or diminish like the impact of climate change. But for me, when I read these tree rings, this gives me a lot of hope, I guess is what I'm saying. It's difficult to focus on trees that are hundreds of years old, and you'll see them do this just time and time again, just endure stress and still have a capacity to respond. And it's difficult to see that over and over again and not have some hope that at least although the stress of the future may be unprecedented, these trees are no strangers to stress, I guess is what I'm saying. So that's my sort of hopeful piece that I'll end on. More or less on time. If there's any questions or comments, happy to. I hope that was okay.
That was great, Charles. Thank you. That's really interesting. And we already have a few questions, but I do want to encourage the audience to please keep submitting questions. And we've got some time, so whatever questions you've got, please submit them. Start with Brenda's question. Brenda's question came in early. It was regarding the tree that you showed us at the beginning, on the old growth trail, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how old that tree is, or do you have any sense of how old that tree is?
No. So that one would be really easy. Would be really difficult to age, because I strongly suspect that it's very rotten in the center. So even if you were to try and extract a very thin wood segment from it, I think that it would just you'd be missing a lot of that record. But based off of, I guess, its physical characteristics, and based off of the ages of the Douglas fir that I mostly see from stumps, I would guess it's in that 400 to 450 kind of range. Quite a few of the oldest stumps that I found dated back to kind of the middle 1500s, right around the year 1550, and there was a few outliers that were substantially older than that, but by and large, that was kind of a not like a sort of hard line in the sand, but there weren't that many trees that were older than that, and there was kind of it was at that point that you kind of started to see these old trees trickle in. So I'm guessing that it'd be somewhere around between 400 and 500 years is I think a pretty good guess.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That was a good question.
April asked, are all these tree ring examples Douglas fir, or are they a bunch of different kinds of trees? Or
Yes, they are all they're all Douglas fir. Another part of the project was aging and examining some of the old forest stands on the college forest, and that involved tree ring science with other species, grand fir, and some big leaf maple and some Pacific yew. But I didn't sort of include any of that in this presentation. So there was a little bit of that as far as that kind of forest development history, but I don't have any like fire scar examples from, say, a big leaf maple or something like that. But those are also trees that are very much on this landscape. And yeah, in the case of both grand fir and big leaf maple and Pacific yew, I mean, those were also trees that were around, albeit at sort of smaller quantities and in lower densities, but very much still in these sort of more persistent forest patches of kind of generally more heavy sort of conifer heavy forest coverage. But they were in there as well. I think the oldest grand fir and big leaf maple, I think I have both go back to like the early 1800s. So not nearly as old, but I mean certainly still before the sort of main clash of cultures around settlement. So yeah, certainly part of the landscape as well.
Thank you. Olivia says and asks, decadal fire regime for large fires sounds pretty frequent to me. Do we have any sense for whether these were cultural burns that were purposefully large or got out of control, or non-human caused wildfire?
That's a really excellent question, and I feel somewhat poorly equipped to answer it. I think you'd really need to speak with. I think you need a team of people to answer that question. Perhaps a tree ring person, perhaps an anthropologist, perhaps also someone with some expertise, just from more of a tribal cultural perspective. Someone that kind of is just more in tune with the culture and with what people were trying to do out there on this landscape. I imagine it's very, very possibly both. Oh gosh, yeah, it's a really interesting question. What I can say is that I would guess that there's still. I'd be more inclined to guess that they are still human caused fires, and that's just because if you look at the comparison of fire frequencies before and after the year 1850. There's a huge reduction. So that's kind of seeing that reduction. In fact, let me just go back. What am I doing here? I should be. So,
yeah, sure.
So you look at this, if you look at before and after the year 1850, so that's kind of the strength of that human signal. So some of these fires after 1850 are still caused by humans. They are settler burning, perhaps burning from improved pasturage or to burn out an old stump so you can plow the field better, or perhaps fires from primitive lumbering efforts and that type of thing. So I guess if you were asking like how much of this is lightning, my guess is that it's that lightning signal is probably no greater than the portion of this graph that is after 1850, I guess is what I'm saying. So certainly very, very possible that lightning could have started some unplanned fires, or or a fire could have sort of gotten away yeah, certainly possible. Well, I probably said more than I ought to have on the subject, but it's a really good question.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you probably need a team of folks to really give you a good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a good answer. Thank
All
you.
right.
Scott asks, do you visit big oaks in Corvallis to core/date them for passionate homeowners?
Um, uh, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, Scott, what was his name? Scott.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Um, there might be some time for that. We'll be in touch. Just
Thanks.
reach out.
And just a nice comment. Really fascinating and important work you're doing, Charles. Thank you. James asks, what's the oldest data set of fire history in the Willamette Valley? Like, how far back have others gone with samples?
So, um, so this wasn't the fire history that I did wasn't the first or the second. The first fire history was actually done back and it was done on the McDonald-Dunn. It was done back in the 1930s by some folks. Really kind of a fascinating little one pager that they did. And I think their record went back to like the 1600s. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was a very early, very very early fire history. And then the next one that I'm aware of is one that was done in the year 2003. Oh, I forget her name. It was very, very well done, and that was done more in the Eugene area, kind of in the valley margins there. I want to
Robbins.
say yes, thank you. I should know that. But anyway, yeah, I want to say her oldest tree went back, yes, to somewhere in the 1500s, very late 1400s. And then in case of my data set, I think the oldest, I think the oldest tree rings that I have come from a stump that was up sort of the upper Soap Creek area. And I think that goes back to kind of the early 1400s. But there's also other ongoing fire history projects that aren't sort of Willamette Valley specific, but they're getting even older ages than that. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly where. I find it a really fascinating topic. You know, what the sort of maximum, just how far we can sort of push the record back. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, those are the projects that I'm aware of as far as that record of depth. Was that their question? Did I answer
Yeah,
it?
I think so.
Yeah.
And yeah, James says thank you. It looks like it. Carolyn asks, does any dendrochronology show impacts of volcanism or ashfall during the lifetime of the tree? For example, the 1980 eruption and earlier eruptions of Mount St. Helens.
Oh, geez. The short answer is I don't know, but I have to think almost certainly. It's just a matter of whether or not you can. And I didn't do this analysis, and this was, I think, would have been kind of a stretch for me to do. But I think being able to do that involves just kind of a little bit more heavy statistics. It just kind of involves being able to tease out that signal from the chronology, from this series of skinnier or fatter tree rings. Being able to sort of test for that signal. There's some very curious sort of anomalies in the tree ring record that don't really make a lot of sense that I've observed, but I don't know if they're the cause of volcanic activity or not. But I have to think that, I mean, somewhere in that 300 or 400-year-old record, trees grew differently as a result of ash being in the sky for a month or more throughout the growing season, and sort of how they changed their growth as a result from that. So, yes, the short answer is I'm sure. I'm just not the person to sort of test for that. But I guess if you were working sort of closer to that Mount St. Helens area, and you're looking for that signal, that would be great, because you could sort of look at what that more recent eruption did and then use that as a a sort of sign for detecting it deeper in the record. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can get out of tree rings, but I just do kind of one small part of it. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Oh, thank you. And that was actually the last question. I wanted to invite Meg and Dave back on just to say a farewell. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Meg, for getting us going. Thanks, Dave, for bringing us all together.
Well, I'd like to ask a question. Is that
Oh,
okay?
please. I would love it.
Mary's Peak.
Yeah.
I've been involved with a lot of people regarding Mary's Peak, and there's a huge debate whether there was any cultural burns up there. And all I get is differences of opinion. And what Meg and Charles, what are your thoughts?
I don't know. All I can say is that in sort of my personal wanderings, I mean, I've been close to the top of Mary's Peak in that, in kind of that noble fir zone. And yeah, certainly stumbled across fire like in noble fir, in both like living and dead noble fir. So I know it's there. I don't know if that, but I wasn't, I didn't actually collect those samples, so I'm not sure kind of how far back in the record, exactly what, the exact dates of the fire scars that I had sort of observed in that field. Although I think, I think that some people have sort of taken a more sort of close look at that and at least detected some fire scars that at least extend before the time of settlement, which doesn't necessarily prove that it's a cultural burn. One thing that I would say, I don't claim to represent any sort of cultural perspective, but I think Mary's Peak is a feature in mythology. I mean, it is very much a feature on that landscape. And so I certainly think that people were there, and just kind of based off of that, I have to think that it was very much a site of cultural burning, but that's just my guess. And yeah, I'm not sort of, by no means an expert on that.
Yeah, I would loop back to Charles's earlier answer where he described a team of people, including Indigenous practitioners and knowledge keepers, to think about that question in a way that involves sort of diverse knowledge systems to try and understand that.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I want to thank both of you and Bonnie. This has been wonderful and just really is very additive to our knowledge base on ancient trees. And we'll never look at trees again the same way. Thank you so much. Look forward to meeting you both in person.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
And thanks for the invitation, and to everyone who's been part of the evening. Please feel free to reach out and chat about fire, coexisting with fire, and using the university as a resource for thinking about those questions. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Bye, Bonnie. Bye, Charles. Bye, Meg.
Good night, everybody. Take care.